Here, good evening, gentlemen. We have an action-packed class planned this evening. We have a lot to talk about and a limited amount of time to talk about it, so let's get going. We have been discussing in the first chapter of Tanya how the first soul of the Jew, which is sometimes called the animal soul, or the nefesh habahamis, is essentially a spiritual statement of I am. God conceals himself to create a level of reality in which things think that they just exist, in which it is not perceived that existence is inherently godly existence. This level is called Klipa and Sitra Achra. It's called the shell reality on the other side. And more precisely, as we learned last week, because last week we introduced two categories to two different types of Klipa, it's called Klipas Nega, which means the translucent shell, the translucent peel, the translucent Klipa. What do we mean by translucent? What we meant, as we explained last week, why is the Jewish animal soul called from Klipas Nega? Because it says, I am. I am is not the worst thing you can say. It's not the most God-denying thing you can say. Because when you say I am, you could also say God is for the same price, right? I am is not a statement that I am exclusively. I am is just I am, and maybe other things exist as well. This is really the Klipas Nega. The Klipas Nega, the translucent shell or the translucent peel, is that level of reality which we would call neutral existence or objective reality, which the level at which things just are. But that doesn't mean that any one thing is exclusively, right? In fact, it's a neutral ground. I am, God could be, the table is, there's rooms, anything can participate in being. This is called Klipas Nega, the translucent shell reality. And this is essentially where we come from, or at least for Jews, where half of us comes from. And in fact, the half that we use more often, the half we're more in touch with more often, the biological vitality of the Jew. This is the spiritual force which literally gives life to the body, which is enclosed within our blood to make us alive, to make a living human being, is this spiritual reality of I am from Klipas Nega. And as we explained, the spiritual I am is also the source of the emotive traits, the emotions of the Jew. Why did we say specifically the emotions? Because in fact, as we're going to see, the animal soul has all of the same faculties as the godly soul, including intellect, right? Because we explained that to the animal soul, the emotions are the main thing. Because a being who exists externally, a being of the shell reality, right, who has to say I am, right? I am is not really the basis of abstract intellect. Abstract intellect, the entire idea of thinking, of the mind, is that the mind can escape the trap of, or the limitations of, I am. So even though the animal soul has a mind, because its mind starts from I am, such as I am thinking, or I am for some reason sitting in a classroom learning this thing, right? Therefore, its mind is not really pure mind. It's not mind in the fullest sense. Even its mind, even its intellect is subservient to its emotions. So really, the highlighted reality of the animal soul deriving from the spiritual I am, the spiritually neutral existence, the prime way it expresses itself is through emotions. And we said that the emotions of the Klipas Nega are what we call both positive and negative emotions, right? Because you could say for the same price, I am arrogant, or I am unserious, right? Or I am sad and heavy, depressed, slothful. But for the same price, you could say, I am happy, I am merciful, I am giving to others, right? Even though they all derive from the spiritual I am, right? As we've now explained, I think 4 classes in a row, we keep explaining, because it's very important to understand Moral good and evil is not the same thing as existential good and evil in the context of the Tanya, or what we've been calling anyway, existential good and evil, which is about reflecting the divine existence versus concealing the divine existence. And so, even though the Klipas Nega is a negative force, because it's a denial of the divine nature of all existence, it's I am rather than God is, or at a more profound level, it's I saying I am rather than God saying I am. Nevertheless, this I am can be morally more righteous, could be morally expressed. Good emotions, like we say, are the national traits of the Jewish people, which is Rahmanim, Bashanim, Gemli, Chasadim, right? Merciful, bashful, and giving of the performing acts of kindness. Or we could reflect the more negative emotions, the I am taken in a more negative direction, a more selfish direction morally, right? Which, of course, the difference between good and bad in terms of denying or acknowledging God versus good and evil, as we like in the good and evil emotions, immediately makes clear that the entire purpose or the entire gist of what the Alter Rebbe's path is going to be in self-refinement and in serving God is not about being a better person. That is not the function, right? Being a better I am is still ultimately being an I am in a denial of God. So while it's better than being a bad I am, certainly, right? As we already know, that's not going to be the full content of what the Alter Rebbe has to say. There's in the way of Panemius, as we were discussing 5 or 6 classes ago, in the Alter Rebbe's whole approach, which is to transform the person from the innermost point, right? The long, short way, which is to totally transform the person from the inside. We can't just worry about how they behave morally or even how they feel. We have to get at the core issue, which is there is one half of us, which we'll start discussing next week, God willing, which is all about God existing. And there's another half of us which starts with the assumption, I am, I exist. Good. So far, so review. Then, last week's class, we began to speak about the very end of chapter 1. The goal for today's class is to finish chapter 1, God willing. It's very ambitious, but we'll try. There's a lot to fit into this class. The end of chapter 1 discusses Gentiles. The end of chapter 1 discusses non-Jews. We said last week the 2 points that Tanya says about non-Jews, which at their face value make us squeamish, make us uncomfortable. The 2 things Tanya says, the Alter Rebbe says about non-Jews, is number 1, their souls come from the Shalosh Klipas HaTameis. Their souls derive from the 3 impure Klipas, the 3 impure shell realities, which, unlike Klipas Nega, unlike the animal soul of the Jew, contains no good in it whatsoever, is not open to godliness. And we said furthermore that the non-Jew has no good in them at all. All the good they do for themselves. Their kindness is considered sin. The goodness that they do is all to show off and for self-aggrandizement, which are very radical statements which make us uncomfortable nowadays. The goal of this week's class is to explain in a more in-depth way what's going on at the end of chapter 1 of Tanya, and to read it inside, God willing, to read the few lines where the Alter Rebbe discusses this, and to finish the first chapter. We discussed last week, we began discussing this idea, and we said that the 3 impure klippas, right? Well, we said actually we won't worry about why there's 3 of them for the moment. The level of reality, the impure klippas, where the non-Jew's soul comes from, according to Tanya, where the Gentile soul comes from, this level of the concealment of God is not just I am. Last week we characterized it as only I am, and even only I, because to even say am is to imply that existence is neutral, right? That other things can exist. Instead, it's only I, that fundamentally the real reality is only I. So in other words, it is the difference between existential neutrality, saying things exist, I exist, maybe other things exist as well, versus the active denial of God, the impure klippus, right, which we say the soul of the nations come from, the soul of the Gentile comes from, are an active denial of God. They're about specifically God does not exist, right? At different levels and in different ways, right? The active opposition to godliness. We also explained last week how not calling the non-Jews not good at all is not technically true, even if we're talking about the existential level, right? Why? Because as we explained last week, all existence is divine existence, even the things which are opposed to God. In Judaism, we don't believe that there is such a thing at the basis level of opposition to God, right? Unlike some other religions, Judaism does not believe that there is really such a thing at the truest level as opposition to God, even the things which oppose God the most, which is the impure klippus, right? Think of a pharaoh, or if pharaoh is too distant, think of Hitler is another good example, who we'll get back to in tonight's class. Tonight's class has Hitler. It's very exciting. The three impure klippus who are in opposition to all goodness, godliness, and holiness, right? Even Hitler, right, is ultimately a reality that exists. If Hitler exists for even a single second, he exists because it's a divine existence. There's nothing else that can exist, as the Alter Rebbe explains at great length later in Tanya, even for a moment, but that it's not a divine existence making it exist, right? So how could you say that Hitler is a divine existence? And the answer is that the goodness within the thing is in a state of what we call galus, which is a topic that the Alter Rebbe explains at length at many different levels. There's many different levels to its meaning. Galus means exile, right? The godliness is in exile within it, which essentially means that the godly reality and the things that oppose God is in a state of utter concealment, and it cannot be freed from the place where it's concealed, at least by conventional methods, right? So even they are not no good at all. Even they are a divine existence in some way, right? We'll discuss more later in Tanya about what this means, that it's in exile, how maybe even it could be freed from exile, all in good time. It's not really our topic here. So far, are there any questions so far? Assuming everyone's paying attention. Okay, good. No questions so far. So, I am going to ask 4 questions. We discussed most of them last week as well. And in fact, the 4 questions, exactly, in the Manishtana. The 4 questions will show, if you pay attention to the 4 questions, you'll see that the end of the first chapter of Tanya is not just controversial for the superficial reasons we discussed last week, but it's actually, there's clearly hidden depths here that a superficial reading can't see. There is a lot involved in the last chapter of Tanya. Most of preparing tonight's class was trying to sieve down all of the many things that could be spoken about in connection with these few lines. These few lines could really be the basis for a week of classes if you really wanted to get really into all of the implications and all of the things it means. And there's so many things. There's history, there's theology, there's metaphysics, there's culture, there's all sorts of very, very interesting things all related to this. So let's ask the Manishtana, let's ask the 4 questions. The 4 questions of why it's, according to these, we've reviewed all of the relevant information. In other words, these 4 questions are in what we just said. What we just said is hard to understand for 4 reasons, basically. I've whittled it down to 4 anyway. 4 that I'd like to address. Number one is, this is a famous question that many of the commentaries on Tanya struggle with. The first question is, why do only Gentiles get the label of good only for their own benefit? Right? That's the description, right? Now, again, these descriptions don't originate in the Tanya. These descriptions come from the Talmud. They come from the Kabbalistic works. These are old descriptions, right? But the question is, according to what we've learned in Tanya, on the contrary, and here you begin to see that in a way, the Alter Rebbe is already, even by bringing this in the first chapter of Tanya, these statements beg for qualification, right? The statements of the Talmud must become weaker and more precise, weaker in the sense of less broad, right? They have to take on a certain precise definition by the way the Alter Rebbe brings them, right? Because the statement says that when a non-Jew does, it says chesed l'umim chatas, which means the kindness of the Gentile is sin. That's a literal translation, right? And all the good that they do only lehisyaher, which Ronnie translated for us last week, to show off, right? The question is, if all of their goodness is actually selfishness, right? Why does that make them any different from any of the rest of us? Right? We just finished explaining for a big portion of chapter 1 that a lot of the good things that Jews do is also selfish. Right? After all, it all comes from the spiritual I am, right? I am a kind person, right? Based in the very existence of the self, the core of the animal self, which is, again, to some extent, a denial of God, right? Instead of saying God exists, which is the true nature of existence, right? It begins with a baseline of neutral existence. There's such a thing as objective reality, which is fundamentally a denial of God. In the eyes of Alter Rebbe, objective reality is the beginning of all the descents. It's where all the problems start. And you start with objective reality, and then eventually you get to Hitler, as we're going to see. Right? That's the progression. So if you start with I am, if even when the Jew does good things, it starts with I am, and that's the Jewish animal soul. Why is the non-Jew singled out as doing good things only for their own benefit? Now, I know what you're thinking the answer to this question is. You're thinking that the Jew at least has the godly soul, which we're going to discuss in chapter 2, and the godly soul, as we're going to see, is purely selfless, right? However, I reject that answer. That answer is insufficient. Why is it insufficient? Because when do we talk about the godly soul? In chapter 2. In chapter 1, to the student of the Tanya, we don't even know the godly soul exists yet. Right? The Alter Rebbe has chosen to bring up this comparison when all we've learned about is the Jewish animal soul, which is the source in its 4 elements of all the negative traits of the Jews, including each Jew's negative traits, including the fire of his arrogance and the air of his empty pride and the water of his lustfulness and the earth of his heaviness and his laziness and his sadness, right? And all of these things is the Jewish animal soul. So why is it that the Gentile gets such a bad rap that we say all of their good is only for self-aggrandizement? It sounds like a lot of the Jews' good begins from that same place of I am. It comes from that same root, right, of fundamental selfishness. So this requires this requires deeper study as to why it's almost as if the Alter Rebbe is demanding we figure this out by putting it in the first chapter, right? If Jewish selflessness comes from the godly soul, this comparison should be in the second chapter. Yeah? The second question is, the switch from the Jewish animal soul to the godly soul. In other words, the progress from I am to God is, right? Or even deeper, like I said before, of I saying I am to God saying I am. That's the real depth of the difference, right? The difference between me saying I am and God saying I am, and how one could progress from one to the other is at this point totally mysterious. There doesn't seem to be any logical explanation for how we can go from me saying I am to God saying I am, right? In personal development, in the sense of, let's say I wanted to transform my animal soul and get rid of this thing covering over God, right? It's at the moment, it's totally unclear how that would even be possible. How could I go from me saying I am to God saying I am? I don't know where I would find God saying I am. It doesn't sound like me, right? That's the issue, right? That is in a way, that's the issue the entire Tanya is coming to answer, right? At some level. By comparison, right, the Jewish I am to going from I am to saying I am for others, right, or I am kind, or I am merciful, right? Even going from only I am to I am kind, and I am devoting my life to others, right, seems to be a smooth transition, right? You can go, it's conceivable, instead of going from me saying I am to God saying I am, which seems to be an uncrossable gap, going from saying only I am to saying merely I am to saying I am devoting my life to others, right, seems to be a spectrum, right? I could move from one to the other. Only I am leaves room for other things to exist. Even only I, right? If I start asking questions about what is I share in common with other things, etc., can get to I am, which then can get to I am devoting my life to others. I'm going to live a selfless life, right? Understand what I'm saying? So it's a spectrum. This spectrum seems to be a simple intellectual reorientation. The person who says only I learns more, thinks more, and can come to say I am, and so on and so forth, and then can refine that I am until they become I am devoting my life to others. I am living a morally selfless, upright, righteous life. In this case, it would seem, going from, given this fact, it would seem that it's possible to think oneself out of being a Gentile. I'll say it again. Given this spectrum, it would seem that it is possible to think oneself out of being a Gentile. If you define the Gentile as coming from the Shalish Klippas Atameas, the impure Klippas, and the impure Klippas is what says only I, yeah? And it's possible to go intellectually, to grow as a person, to go from saying only I to I am devoted to others. It would seem that a person could think themselves out of being the Gentile the Alter Rebbe is discussing. Yes. Sure.
Having these thoughts, I am versus I am in service of others.
Yeah.
Does anything really change until we actually do something for others?
Absolutely. We're assuming that the each level is reflected in the person's behavior. That's the assumption here. We're not saying the person is just sitting and thinking. We're saying that this becomes the core, because really when we say I am, what are we talking about? We're talking about the soul itself, right? Not just thoughts, but the very root of being, right? Which is kind of a different way of asking the same question I'm asking right now, which is that we're saying the very root of being of a Gentile, the Alter Rebbe seems to be saying, is only I, fundamentally, right? However, and I can kind of understand how the root of being could be I am versus God saying I am, right? I can understand how that defines my being in a way that it's immutable, right? I can't change. I can't grow like an apple seed doesn't grow into an elephant. I can't grow into God saying I am. At least I don't see any obvious way that's possible, right? At least in a stepwise fashion. There's no process which can bring the two things together, right? At least in no obvious one. Whereas, if the core of my being is only I, that core seems very mutable, right? The difference between only I and I am, which the Alter Rebbe is saying is apparently the difference between the Jew's animal soul and the non-Jew's animal soul, which the Alter Rebbe is going out of his way to describe, right? The difference between those two things doesn't seem like such an immutable, fundamental, existential core difference. It seems like it's possible to reorient oneself one to the other, right? So what Tanya seems to be calling a fixed category, right? The difference between, where do you go to find out the difference between Jew and non-Jew, right? Well, in the animal soul anyway, leaving aside the godly soul for a moment, you find the difference in the animal soul between the two at the end of the first chapter of Tanya. So it doesn't make any sense, right? The difference between the two is not an unbridgeable gap, the way that a non-Jew and a Jew is an unbridgeable gap, where they're two different things. And for one to become the other requires some kind of fundamental transformation. All parties seem to agree, right? Whereas this is on a simple spectrum, right? It seems that it's just a different form, a different perspective on oneself. That's the second question. The second question is that what the Alter Rebbe seems to be referring as the difference between the Jewish animal soul and the non-Jewish animal soul, right, seems to be a very malleable difference. That's my second question. Understand the second question? You're looking at me like I'm crazy, no? For a different reason, not for this.
No, because I'm my own.
You're processing, yes.
One more question.
Processing is good. Yes, please.
How would I identify if somebody is existing in the I only and an I am, like from a fundamental behavioral, how would I see somebody?
That's a good.
Say that person is existing from an I only.
That's a good question. Let's see if you still have the same question at the end of the class. Okay. The third of my 4 questions on the end of chapter 1 of Tanya is the $1 million question. The $1 million question that everyone wants to ask. The question that keeps the teachers of the end of chapter 1 of Tanya up at night and tossing and turning, right? The question they're afraid to be asked is everything Gentiles do really so bad? Yeah. Now, because no good in them at all seems a rather strong statement. Yes, and again, the statement comes from the Talmud. It's not the Alter Rebbe's fault, but still, what does this mean, right? No good in them at all. Seems to be tough to square with the evidence, let's put it that way. We understand that when he says there's no good in them at all, you could understand it different ways, by the way. We already understand this. We've already pointed this out, right? It depends what the Alter Rebbe means. Because if the Alter Rebbe means existentially, right, that's one thing. Because as Josh kind of just pointed out, we don't really experience others' existential states necessarily in very obvious ways. So when you say that there's no good in them at all, and you mean in their spiritual root is in denial of God, such that the God's very being and essence is in exile within their very essence, right? Or something like that, then I understand a little bit more maybe, right? How you could maybe say there's no good in them at all, because you're not talking about their behavior or their emotions even, or their inner personality even. You're talking about what grounds all of that, what's deeper than all of that, right? However, textually, to say that this is only an existential statement actually doesn't work, right? Why? Because the Alter Rebbe brings all these quotes together and makes all these statements in a row where he's talking about the kindness of the non-Jews is sin, right? That's not talking about their fundamental existential state, right? On the contrary, that's talking about behavior, right? Emotion, right? When they do something good, it's all for their self-aggrandizement, right? And the $1 million question is, that doesn't seem to really be true. That's the $1 million question. The question is an empirical question, right? Which you'll be interested to know that in Chassidus, sometimes we do have a bit of empiricism, right? You'll see in many Maimarim and in many discourses, I believe in the Tanya as well, you'll see a language like Kanira B'chush, which means as we see with our own eyes, right? Your own eyes are important. You should trust your own eyes. When you see something with your own eyes, it doesn't seem to fit with Tanya, you have to learn, you have to dig deeper, right? Rather than walk around with blinders and pretend it doesn't exist. Either one, right? Some people choose one. We choose one of them not to exist, right? Depending on what we had for breakfast, right? Either I pretend the Tanya doesn't say it, or I pretend my eyes didn't see it, right? Whereas it would seem that the Alter Rebbe would want us to try and find how the Alter Rebbe could say this, right? The fourth question of the 4 questions is, why is the Alter Rebbe talking about Gentiles at all? That's the 4th question. This is a book for Jews. Gentiles really don't come up much in this book, is the truth. This is the most famous place by far where they come up, right in the first chapter. It's not really about This book is a practical life guide for Jews. We don't philosophize about random subjects in Tanya. Elsewhere in Chassidus, there's philosophizing about almost every subject under the sun. But Tanya is famously not like that. Tanya is famously, in a way, a very practical book in its own way, whatever we mean by practical, right? Although I did joke that maybe we should call this class the Impractical Tanya, as opposed to the Practical Tanya, the book by Rav Chaim Miller. Rav Chaim Miller wrote the Practical Tanya, so this class should maybe be called the Impractical Tanya, because of how slow we go, right? Anyway, doesn't matter. The end of chapter 1 is talking about something that there's no obvious benefit to my service of God from telling me about the nature of non-Jews, right? And even if you want to say he's doing it to contrast with the Jewish animal soul, the question at the end of the day is, what does it add to our understanding, right? You could have just told me the Jewish animal soul is from Klippas Noga, right? It comes from I am. It's the source of the emotions. It's the source of life. That's what the Jewish animal soul is. What do you gain by contrasting it with the non-Jewish animal soul? Why even talk about non-Jews, really, if this book is a practical guide for how Jews can reach God and relate to God? And as we'll see from chapter 2 and onward, is really exclusively for Jews, right? It really is, in its practical guidance, meant for Jews, right? So what really is this doing here? Yeah, that's the fourth question. So I'll recap the questions very briefly. Question number 1 was, why do only Gentiles get called good only for their own benefit? It seems like when Jews do good with their animal soul, it's also only for their own benefit. Number two was the spectrum, right? Where the difference between the non-Jew and the Jewish animal soul seems very fluid, right? And possible to change and shift intellectually. Number 3 was the $1 million question, which is, it seems that non-Jews have good to them. And question number 4 was, why does Tanya even talk about this, right? The goal of the remainder of the class is to have a discussion, and at the end of that discussion to have the answers to all 4 questions. So we're going to go into the weeds. It may seem like we're talking about random things, but the goal is, what I'm hoping to be able to do, maybe a little difficult, is from that discussion to grab out the answer, all 4 answers to these 4 questions. So, without further ado, the first thing to talk about is the second question, about that spectrum of transformation, right? Where we say that from the non-Jewish animal soul to the Jewish animal soul, as described in the first chapter of Tanya, seems to be a spectrum, seems malleable, seems like something that can change through intellectual reorientation. The answer to this question, we're starting with the answer to that question, we'll recap all the answers at the end, but the answer to this question is absolutely 100% that is the case. In fact, you can think yourself out of being a Gentile, as the Alter Rebbe is defining the Gentile at the end of chapter 1 of Tanya. In fact, this is not an immutable category. It's not describing all non-Jews, which to become Jewish you would have to go through some kind of ritual process, etc., right? The end of chapter 1 of Tanya is describing only a subset of non-Jews. And you can leave that subset simply through educating yourself, right? Through simply changing certain external facts, right? More external realities. The person can leave this category entirely, right? Let's explore how this is so. In Judaism in general, in Jewish law, there is a category called Chasidei Umas Ha'elam, right? Which means the righteous among the Gentiles. You may have heard of this in connection with Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem maintains a list of the righteous among the Gentiles who were non-Jews, who helped Jews in the Holocaust, right, etc. But this is a halachic category. This is a category in Jewish law which goes back many, many years, right? Jewish law governs, just like it governs which shoe to put on first in the morning, which shoe to tie, it also governs Jewish, non-Jewish relations, right? All sorts of laws in Jewish law. How is a Jew to relate to non-Jews, right? And as the law shakes out, not all non-Jews are created equal. There's all different types of non-Jews, right? Obviously, as makes logical sense. So generally, we will look at 3 categories. Really, explicitly, there's only 2, but it turns out halachically, and I did some research on this. The research was a bit meager. Like I said, you could do a whole other class just on this. Halachically, there's really, in a sense, 3 categories. The 3 categories are as follows. The lowest of the 3 and the worst of the 3 is literal idolaters, right? People who literally worship idols. Now, you obviously have a question, what does it mean to worship idols? Which would be another hour of the week-long class, right? But to put it we'll discuss more about that in a second, okay? What it means to worship idols. You have idolaters. You have Chasidei Umas Ha'ilam, the righteous among the nations. The righteous among the nations are technically defined as those who keep the 7 Noahide laws, which are the 7 laws in Judaism that are for the entire world to keep. For what purpose is the non-Jew told by God in the Torah to keep the 7 Noahide laws? For the purpose of Yishuv Ha'ilam, which literally means the settling of the world, or alternatively, the building up of civilization. God's desire is that the world should not be chaotic, but rather that the world should be settled, right? Settled and transformed in civilization. The 7 rules to follow, which just like we say in Judaism, there's 613 rules to follow. It's not actually as simple as that. The 7 rules are actually 7 categories. There's actually hundreds of rules, just like any one of the Torah's mitzvahs is not one. It's not like a sentence, right? It's a life sentence. It's not one sentence, right? So so to the 7 Noahide laws are more of they fill books. It's not such a small thing. But the 7 Noahide laws are for the purpose of the 7 rules of maintaining civilization. It's an interesting list. You have things you might expect, like don't murder and don't steal. You have religious tenets, primarily belief and respect for God and not worshiping idols. And you also have some things you might not expect, like establishing courts of law, and cruelty to animals is banned. It's one of the most interesting of the seven Noahide laws. And these, like I said, these are all categories, right? There's many subcategories which you wouldn't immediately expect, right? For example, non-Jews have to give charity as well. And it's a debate among the rabbis which of the 7 categories this falls under, but the fact remains that it's an obligation, right? And there's many such things. So their laws are actually much more involved than the list of 7 might first imply. So these are the righteous among the nations. And the truth is that to really be halachically considered a Noahide, right, you are actually meant to declare that you will follow the 7 Noahide laws. You believe the 7 Noahide laws were given to Moses on Mount Sinai with the rest of the Torah, right? And you're going to follow them, and you're supposed to declare this before a Jewish court. That's really the fullest definition of a Noahide, of someone who keeps the 7 Noahide laws, which is called the righteous among the nations. However, between an actual idolater and a full-fledged halachic Noahide, which, as you can imagine, are quite rare, right? Nowadays, there actually are small communities that are growing, but in general, quite rare. In between, you have a whole range, because it turns out that halachically, even someone who keeps the 7 Noahide laws by default, based on their own reasoning, not because it was given to Moses in the Torah on Mount Sinai, right, is definitely not considered a full-fledged idolater. Right. So in other words, you can be like a righteous among the nations without being a full-fledged idolater. Okay. That's the deal of the 7 Noahide laws. And it turns out that what the Alter Rebbe says at the end of the first chapter of Tanya is not about the righteous among the nations. The righteous among the nations, as explained in the Alter Rebbe's own Chassidus, and elsewhere by the Tzemach Tzedek and all the different commentators on the Tanya, because you see elsewhere in Chassidus immediately that the Alter Rebbe says different things about other, and in the Kabbalistic sources as well, etc. The righteous among the nations do not have their root in the 3 impure klippas. The righteous among the nations have their root in klippas noiga, just like the Jewish animal soul. In other words, the Jewish animal soul is very similar to the soul of a Gentile who is a righteous among the nations, and even a Gentile who's a righteous among the nations by default, right? Rather than on purpose and with intention, which is the full-fledged category. And I have news for you. Most of the non-Jews that you have met living in the United States in recent years, for example, right, are Noahide law keepers by default, right? Even if they don't even know what the Noahide laws are, right? The vast majority keep the Noahide laws. The vast majority are 4 courts of law. They don't practice animal cruelty. They don't murder. They don't steal. They believe in God and they don't worship idols, right? More or less, right? So, fundamentally, a lot of the non-Jews you will have met are considered, for many purposes, the righteous among the nations. the two beliefs, so to speak, and really this is like oversimplifying, but we'll go with it. The two laws pertaining to beliefs in the Noahide laws are belief in God and repudiation of idol worship. Yes. So you can't be righteous among the nations and idolater simultaneously, right? You understand? Mutually exclusive categories. In these two laws, being in the Noahide laws, if you dig into this a little, you find the answer to many of the questions at the end of Tanya, right? Why? When you think of a modern idolater in the modern world, you would be much better served, I would argue, and this is my own opinion. This now what I'm going to say now is unsourced. This is my opinion. You would be much better served thinking about a modern idolater who's an idol worshiper in the modern world. You'd be much better and understand Torah much better if you thought of Hitler before you thought of an actual person who bows down to an actual physical idol. There's many reasons for this. This is a long discussion. The short version is that the ancient idolatry, right, to which Judaism is opposed, right, like the idolatry of Haman, right, for example, of Haman, who used to wear an idol around his neck, and he would have people bow down to him and to the idol on his neck, right? And Mordechai the Jew, Mordechai a Yehudi, famously refused, right? The Talmud asks, why is Mordechai is in case you don't know, Mordechai is the first person in the Torah to be called a Jew, right? The word Jew, the first person in history that the word Jew, which derives from Judean, right, or of the tribe of Judah, was applied to was Mordechai. Yeah.
He wasn't Jew.
What? And the question is, the famous question the Talmud asks, pardon? Yehudi. The famous question asked in the Talmud of why the Megillah calls Mordechai HaYehudi, Mordechai the Jew. That's his name, right? The famous question of the Talmud is that where it calls him Mordechai the Jew, it's just finished telling you that he's from the tribe of Benjamin. He's not a Jew. He's not a Yehudi. Right? He's not the descendant of the biblical Judah. He's a descendant of the biblical Benjamin. He's in the tribe of Benjamin. He's a Benjaminite, not a Judean, right? So why does he called Yehudi, right? The Talmud says that anyone who is a kafir in Avodah Zarah, anyone who's a heretic against idol worship is called a Jew, right? A Talmudic definition of Jew is an anti-idolater. That's the Talmudic definition of Jew, right? And by the way, it goes both ways. What's the Talmudic definition of an idolater? We could propose, is someone who's anti-Jew, right? Which is why you see an immediate connection to Hitler, for example, right? This is very interesting. What? I believe so. I don't know about halachically. I can't speak for Jewish law, right? But I would say absolutely that in this generation, in the last 100 years, Hitler is the embodiment of idolatry. Absolutely. So the question is like this. What ties together, this is the question you may be wondering yourself in different words, what ties together rabid hatred of Jews, being incredibly evil, right? Murderer, liar, like Hitler, etc., right? And number 3, bowing down to a statue, right? These are 3 things, and I would propose this is a major issue for Jews to figure out, because in modern times, nowadays, by nature, sort of by default, not on purpose, right? But by default, these 3 things have sort of wandered away from each other in our way of looking at the world. Whereas, if you read all the Torah sources, these 3 things are all intimately related one to one another, right? The Talmudic, the Torah's paradigms of idolaters are all haters of Jews, right? Pharaoh is a paradigm of idolatry. Haman is a paradigm of idolatry, right? Every time you find someone that wants to destroy the Jews, they're also idolaters, and not just idolaters. Usually they want people to bow down to them. They say they're a god, right? Idolatry and hatred of Jews is all wrapped up one with the other, right? And our question is, but why? There's no obvious, right? And then you have the profound moral evil, right? You could theoretically hate Jews without being a mass murderer, like Pharaoh or Haman or Hitler, right? Why is it that these things go together, right? And then you have what we normally typically think of, and as Jewish law also would consider, idolatry, which is literally like bowing down to a statue, which to us seems so ridiculous as to be purely innocuous. We don't even relate to like the story of Abraham smashing his father's idols, right? Like, what's the statue? Why would anyone bow down to one, right? So this is I can't say we can explain this whole thing tonight, like I said, the week of classes, but this is a mystery that has fascinated me for some time. This is very interesting to me. This is something I've thought about a lot and studied different sources on, the connection between all of these things. I believe that the Rebbe even has a sicha, if I recall correctly. I can't remember the exact language, so I'm hesitant to say it. But the Rebbe basically says that Hitler is the epitome of idolatry in our time. Hitler is the greatest idolater. Hitler is the apex of opposition, direct opposition to God, which in the Torah's eyes means idolatry. These things are all, in the Torah's view, these things are all connected, right? You also have other obvious connections, right? For example, in the Jewish law, pardon?
Wait.
What?
Wait.
Wait, what?
That doesn't make sense. You have to go back to different things. Idolatry, you just said that Hitler was doing everything anti-Jewish.
Yeah.
But a statue or an idol, which is a rock,
Yes.
for all intents and purposes, doesn't do anything.
Well, it's the person worshiping the rock, but yes, that is the question. That's exactly my question now. What connects all these things? These things have wandered away from each other. They seem unrelated to us. That's exactly my point. So too, you see in Jewish law, for example, if a Jew is traveling on the road with an idol worshiper, right? The Jew halachically has to protect himself. You're not allowed to put yourself in danger in Jewish law, right? Which itself raises questions. What's danger? What do I mean? Putting myself in danger. Go study Talmud for 10 million years and get back to me, right? But the question is the view of Jewish law is that if you're traveling with an idolater, right, you have to be actively aware that this person could just kill you, basically, right? This seems hard. It's hard for us. You see the issue? This is hard for us to really understand. Nowadays, so nowadays when you think of an idolater, right, you should think of a Nazi. You understand? A Jew is traveling with a Nazi, right? Of course you're not allowed to just travel with a Nazi. And if you're forced to travel with a Nazi, you would be forced to take care of yourself, protect yourself, don't put yourself in any obvious danger. He could kill you at any moment, right? You see why in many ways it's a much better way of thinking about it than actual modern religious idolatries, which you would consider, which in the Torah's view are maybe not even the same as the ancient form of idolatry, because there's stories in the Talmud about how the desire for idolatry has weakened over time and is removed from the world. And in fact, true idolatry is something much more spiritual and intellectual than most people nowadays are even capable of or equipped for. This is a whole sugya. There's a lot to say about this, yeah? The point I want to bring out is like this. Let's go back to the Rebbe's letters. This whole thing is based mostly on the Rebbe's letters, by the way. A lot of what we're going to discuss. A lot of what we're discussing. I'm going to explain this as quickly as possible. It deserves more time. In the Rebbe's letters, you see a strange dichotomy. You see almost a contradiction. There are people who were atheists who wrote to the Rebbe, right? And they told the Rebbe up front, not shy, right? I don't believe in God, I don't believe in anything. And the Rebbe's response usually to the atheist is, I don't believe you. That's the response. That's what the Rebbe would write. The Rebbe would say, I don't believe you when you say you don't believe in God. You could say this and say that. You could say all day long, right? And usually, especially when the atheist would say, I don't believe in God because of injustice in the universe, right? The Rebbe would write usually the same thing. And the thing that the Rebbe would write is your upsetness at the injustice in the universe reflects your belief in God, right? And so you're a contradictory person. You say you don't believe in God, right? But then when you tell me you're upset about injustice, that means you believe in God. So you basically make up your mind, right? This is all... It's not these two things are in contradiction. The Rebbe's response to people who said they were atheists is, I don't believe you. And by the way, I'll just note that, of course, the Rebbe's whole perspective is the perspective of Chassidus, of course. The Rebbe's whole, there's nothing but Chassidus in the Rebbe's letters. And I'll point out to you that while Chassidus talks about idolatry a lot, It almost never talks about atheism. Almost never. Extremely rare. Extremely rare. One or two places talks about atheism. Atheism is extremely not treated in Chassidus. Chassidus seems to believe that idolatry is a much more profound issue than atheism. Right? The Rebbe doesn't believe in atheism. And that's correct. That's also true. Absolutely. But even modernly, there's not a lot of atheists. And those people who say they're atheists, fundamentally, Chassidus doesn't believe them, more or less. Right? However, that's the first half. The second half, the seeming contradiction, is like this. The Alter Rebbe spoke many times about the Holocaust, right? The Rebbe spoke many times about the Holocaust. The Rebbe's position on the Holocaust was two things. Number one, there is no rational explanation for the Holocaust. And when the Rebbe says no rational explanation, he means no rational religious explanation. People have religious explanations of the wrath of God and sinners. The Rebbe wasn't interested. The Rebbe said, there is no way, there is no sin that could possibly justify the Holocaust as a response. The Rebbe rejected the rationalization of the Holocaust. There is no explanation of the Holocaust. And in fact, the Rebbe says that you would be a worse person if you believed there was. You're a better person for not believing there's a rational explanation in the Holocaust. On the other hand, the Rebbe said everything that a person sees and hears, which is teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, is of course a lesson in the service of God. And the Rebbe would learn a lesson from the Holocaust. What's the lesson the Rebbe would learn from the Holocaust? The lesson the Rebbe would learn from the Holocaust, which is itself controversial in its own way and requires study. The lesson the Rebbe would learn from the Holocaust is that look at what the most civilized, advanced, cultured civilization on the face of the earth in world history did when they forgot that God was watching them. More or less. That's more or less what the Rebbe learned. In other words, what the Rebbe learned from the Nazis, what the Rebbe taught people about the Nazis, is that the Nazis was a God deficiency. Right? When the civilization stops believing in God, they'll do anything. Right? Which sounds exactly like what the halacha says about idolaters. Right? They're idolaters, if you're walking on the road on the side of a mountain with an idolater, you should know, first of all, it's forbidden because they could just push you off the mountain and kill you at any moment. Right? So the Rebbe says about the Nazis that the entire cultural development of the Nazis and their acts was because that entire society lost roots and lost connection with God. And that was ultimately the lesson to learn, is that if you want to prevent something from that happens again, people need God. God makes people better. You can see this in the Rebbe's campaign for a moment of silence in the public schools, etc. It's connected to many other things. Do you see the contradiction between these two positions? When the atheist would write the Rebbe said, I don't believe you. However, when a person would ask the Rebbe about the Holocaust, the Rebbe would say the Holocaust is because they were all atheists. See the issue? So what would happen if a Nazi wrote the Rebbe? One wonders, right? It's like a paradox, right? But the truth is, it's not a paradox. It's not a paradox at all. In fact, it's perfectly logical if you read carefully and you understand the Rebbe's intention. And this is directly relevant to what we're discussing in Tanya, because there is a difference between being an ideological atheist, which for the Rebbe counts for very little, doesn't really, to consciously have come to the intellectual conclusion that you're an atheist, the Rebbe is not impressed by, basically doesn't believe in, more or less, thinks it's empty, relatively speaking. Then there's being a godless person. Being a godless person has nothing to do with being an atheist. In fact, the Rebbe would tell the atheist, you're actually a godly person. Look, you're upset about injustice in the world. That itself is a connection to God that you're expressing, right? The Nazis were not atheists. The Nazis were godless, right? And I would argue that, in fact, the real idolaters, right, which again is someone who doesn't even keep the 7 Noahide laws by default. It descends into this, as we'll explain in a moment, right? It's not an intellectual position, right? It's a sickness of the soul. There's two different things, right? Intellectual, schmintellectual, you could say you believe in God, don't believe in God. It's all in your conscious mind. It doesn't matter as much anyway. True godlessness, right? True godlessness is losing touch with something in the human soul which is aware at all times of God. Yes, there's something in the human soul which has the potential to know God. There is some depth of the human soul which is aware and which knows God almost by default, right? And if a person loses touch with that, right, which the Rebbe argues is what happened to the entire German civilization, right? They descended into that en masse. Enough people, right, descended onto. And there's also interesting subtleties here about the personal versus the collective. It's the whole thing. But their whole civilization descended into a state where they lost touch with that. Right now, consider as follows. The Rebbe says such a descent is possible civilizationally. What does that mean? There's such a thing as a godless culture, the Rebbe says, right? What does that mean, right? It means that whatever this deep awareness of God that people have, right, that existed in Germany before it descended into the Holocaust or whatever, right? Whatever this deep awareness of God is, right, it's something that you can learn and it's something that you can unlearn. It's something that intellectually can be acquired and it's something intellectually that can be lost, right?
How can you lose something?
Over time, you forget. It's like forgetting.
It's
forgetting. You forget an idea. And over generations, right? The children are not educated in it. They're not educated to be aware of it, right?
To take like away from the Nazis.
But wait. I can't have enough time, unfortunately. I wish I had time, but I don't. Like this. We're probably going to go way over anyway, so I apologize in advance if anyone has to leave. It's something that you can lose. It's something you can forget, right? The argument, putting all of this together, we've gone on a whole journey about lots of different things. Putting all of this together, what do you see? The keeping of the 7 Noahide laws, yes, which the Tanya seems to imply makes you no longer from the 3 impure klippas. The keeping of the 7 Noahide laws, even by default, although not ideal, right? Even to keep them by default, this preserves civilization. This preserves it keeps things from descending into idolatry, right? Which now you have a very good picture of what idolatry is, right? Of what idolatry is. Idolatry is literally, the example you should think of is Nazi Germany, right? What keeps things from descending into that is keeping the 7 Noahide laws. How? And how do we understand this spiritually? Because once you understand this, you will now see the connection to bowing down to a stone, right? So let's try and explain it briefly. We said that the Jewish animal soul is I am. We said that the non-Jewish soul is only I, right? We've now also said that apparently you can intellectually travel between them. The only I can learn how to be I am, and I am can forget I am and become only I. That's what we've been discussing in different words, right? And we've said that fundamentally the difference is the 7 Noahide laws, right? Particularly belief in God and not bowing down to idols. Why? Now we get back to the definition of idolatry. Idolatry really, right, is to say that something that is knowable is unknowable, right? Or to reduce the unknowable to the knowable in the opposite directions, right? I'll say again. Idolatry is really to say that something knowable, you treat something knowable as if it's unknowable, or you reduce the unknowable to the knowable, right? For example, I know the form of the sun, right? But I treat the sun, right, as if it's God. I treat the knowable as if it's unknowable, right? Or alternatively, I believe in God, the ultimate unknowable God, right? But I don't deal with him, I deal with his knowable manifestation. For example, the sun, right? The Son is not a separate being necessarily. The Son is a manifestation of God. But I deal only with the knowable, right? The thing that I can know, the thing that I can understand, right? God is too far, I can't understand him. I'll deal just with the thing I understand, right? Or the opposite. I take the thing that I understand, which is the Son, and I call that God, right? More or less. More or less, this is what idolatry is. This itself is a week of classes. So, what's so dangerous about that? How does that eventually reach the Nazis in the modern parallel, right? I'll explain to you. There's a vicious cycle. There's a vicious cycle in worshiping the knowable. The vicious cycle works like this. Because I'm worshiping this thing, that means that ultimately I find myself, my root is in this thing, right? This thing creates me or sustains me, like the sun, right? You ever wonder why all the old religions personify the sun, right? The old idolatries, right? They make the sun into a person, right? So some like to say, some have the theory that it's just their imagination run wild, right? I would say it's much more profound than that. I think it's much deeper. I think the ancient idolaters looked at the sun. They said, the source of my vitality is in the sun. I am a person, right? So the sun must be at least a person. Because where do I come from? I come from the sun, right? Or the Nile in Egypt, right? Or any other finite and limited force, right? So just as I'm a person, right? And I am below them, they're the God. They're the one that sustains me. I need them, they don't need me, right? If that's the case, they must be at least as great as I am, right? Personify them. They're people. They're not just, they may look like they're just things from the outside, but clearly they're greater than I am. They must be people, right? Which is a very logical conclusion to come to, by the way. A very sensitive conclusion to come to, like of an intellectually curious and sensitive person. There's a fascinating teaching of the Chassam Sofer, which says like this. The Chassam Sofer, I think I've said it in this class before, the Chassam Sofer, a famous halachist of the early 20th century, late 19th century, I believe, he says, why is it that Jews are not allowed to shave their whole head, right? The Torah, there's law against shaving your whole head, including the corners, right? Including here in front of the ears, which are called the payas, right? And that's why Jews leave their side locks uncut, because it's forbidden to cut all your hair, right? Why? The Torah says it's idolatrous practice, right? To shave your whole head. The Chassam Sofer says, why is it an idolatrous practice to shave your whole head? What's inherently idolatrous about that? Chassam Sofer says a fascinating and infinitely illuminating thing. Like the first time I learned it, I was astounded, and the more I think about it, the more astounded I become. It's incredible. It's like a whole world in this few paragraphs of the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer says as follows: it's psychological, right? Why is it that an idolater shaves their whole head? An idolater shaves their whole head because the idolater's God is created in their own image of what they think the highest thing is, right? So because the idol has an image, that's what makes it an idol, right? It's some kind of form, right? The form that the idol has is the highest thing that they can conceive of, right? Based on whoever they are, right? And whatever their priorities are, etc. The idol is the highest thing they can conceive of, right? Most people are sensitive enough to realize that people are higher than most things that are in nature, which is why you have so many classic paganisms with human-like deities, right? You have your Zeus and your etc., right? You have all your human-like deities, and that idols that are worshipped, lowercase g gods, right? That are worshipped in all the ancient pantheons and most of the ancient religions, right? So you worship that form, that thing that you think is highest. However, so the ancient idolaters, said the Chassam Sofer, would make statues and likenesses, right? It's all about the form anyway. This is a deep psychological thing, right? The problem is that hair is very, very difficult to recreate in any kind of synthetic fashion, as anyone who tries to make shaitels nowadays knows, right? Nowadays still, even with all our techniques, the best hair is still actual human hair. It's very hard to synthesize realistic hair, right? So the idolaters were trying to attach hair to their forms and the things they would bow down to. But ultimately, it's very difficult to make real hair look like the real thing, right? And when they realized that they couldn't give hair to the idols, what did they have to do? They had to shave their own head, right? Because there can't be something which is truly the highest, right? It can't be that I have hair and the idol doesn't, right? So you shave my own head to fit the idol, right? Gentlemen, this is the spiritual core of idolatry. This is really this is what idolatry is. This is why you go from bowing down to a statue to pushing a Jew off a mountain. That's really the connection. The connection is that the idolater is trapped. When you worship a form, right? It's really anyone that's, nowadays you see this all the time, because in a small way, among ideologues, right? People who are fanatically devoted to some finite form, right? To some idea, political party, political figure, for example, right? Not to make it too personal, but people are devoted to all kinds of finite forms, right? It cannot be that I have something in myself that's broader and deeper and more profound than the form I see in the external world. There's a fundamental tension, right? And in fact, Abraham would tell you, the religions of Abraham would tell you that no external form will ever be as great as an actual human soul, right? That's the whole point. That's why Abraham smashed the idols, right? In the bottom line. It's a long discussion, but that's why he smashed the idols, because ultimately he realized that there's more to the person worshiping the idol than there is to the idol, which has been true of every idol since the beginning of time, right? That's the fundamental insight that brings a person to monotheism, right? That if there are no known form is as great as the unknowable human soul that is worshiping it, right? So, what do you have to do? You have to limit and confine what's humanly possible in the worshiper, right? So that it's less and more defined than the thing that they ascribe to. I can't go into this anymore, but I just recommend that you look at anyone that's devoted to any ideology or political party or politician, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about, right? The person, by definition, has to limit what's possible for a human being, right? Because they have to fit themselves into this form, exactly as the Chassam Sofer describes, right? And what happens is that the person loses touch. The person loses touch with any pursuit of the actual truth. Truth defined here as simply being what you are, right? No self-deception, no self-limitation, right? Of actually being the human being exactly as they are, which is fundamentally formless, by the way. The human being has within them a profound, silent, formless depth in the soul. Every human being. So, because the human being limits what's humanly possible, and they limit themselves, and they limit the human self, right? That is how they eventually come to killing people, murder, right? They always end up hating the Jews, by the way. You'll notice that extremists who are like idolaters of every ideology and every belief, in every case, throughout human history, in every country, all end up hating the Jews. You'll notice, right? It's not about extremism, right? Extremism is a poor modern word to try and describe what you're looking at. What you're really looking at is the idolater of each category, right? Of each country, of each thing, right? Why do they all end up hating the Jews? Because the Jew is fundamentally the opposition in the world to this idea, to this comfortable, small, limited human being that the idol worshiper must become, right? And even the Jews themselves don't know how much of an opposition they are. In other words, it's not something that we do, it's actually something that's done through us by God, which is the real story, which all the opponents of the Jews know. It's not about what we think we're doing. It's actually about, we are something that is put into history as the chosen people of God, right? So all of these things are connected. A long rant, I apologize. But these things are all connected. Idolatry is connected. Hatred of Jews is connected. And the forfeiting of all moral principle, right? In order to fit into a defined and limited form of a worldview, right, is also connected. It's all connected, right? So that's how you go from bowing down to an idol all the way down into the lowest possible depths. What prevents this from happening? Why today are so many non-Jews good? I have to tell you two stories before we get to that. I apologize. It's probably going to be another 10 or even maybe 15 minutes. I apologize in advance. We're running late. I'm sorry. The idea is like this. We'd have to split it into a whole other class tomorrow. That's the problem. Next week, I mean. I would really like to finish the chapter this week. Two stories. The first story is of the Rebbe. The second is of the Alter Rebbe. The first story of the Rebbe is that a certain Jew whose name was, his last name was Jaffe. I forget what his first name was. It was a Jew who lived in England who had a very close relationship with the Rebbe, and there's books and books of their correspondence. One of the Rebbe's most frequent letter writers in exchange, right? Very, very common, over decades, a whole conversation in letters, a very long one, right? At some point, he asked the Rebbe this about the end of chapter 1 of Tanya, right? He says, "How can you say that the non-Jews have no good in them at all?" You know what the Rebbe wrote back? The Rebbe basically wrote back, in a sense, check your privilege. It's not really what he said, but that's roughly what he said. What he wrote to him was that if you think back, what happened and at this point it was probably like 3 decades ago. Now it's more. Right? But if you look back at the Holocaust that took place in the middle of the 20th century, and how the whole world knew about it and they just watched and they didn't care, right? The Rebbe says that the Alter Rebbe is too kind to the Gentile in Tanya. That's what the Rebbe writes to him, which is a bit of a shocking statement. But the main reason that I'm bringing it up is because you see immediately, right, what was the Rebbe thinking about in connection with the end of chapter 1 of Tanya is the Nazis. The connection was not made initially by me. That's the main reason I bring it up. The second story is of the Alter Rebbe. There's a famous story with the end of chapter 1 of Tanya that any Tanya class would be criminally negligent not to tell you at the end of chapter 1 of Tanya. The famous story of the author of the Tanya regarding the end of chapter 1 of Tanya is, as you know, the Alter Rebbe was imprisoned, right? He was imprisoned by the Tsar in Tsarist prison. And in Tsarist prison, there were many interrogations. It's very interesting because in recent years, in the old archives, some of these interrogations have even been, records of these interrogations from the Tsarist authorities have even been rediscovered, which is fascinating. But there was one interrogation where someone who was very learned in the Alter Rebbe's teachings themselves, right, possibly even a Jewish person, I can't remember, who was working for the Tsar, right, asked the Alter Rebbe all sorts of theological questions. All sorts of questions about the Alter Rebbe's philosophy, right, in his interrogation. And it says they asked him 9 questions, and the Alter Rebbe answered all 9 questions. And the 10th question was about the end of chapter 1 of Tanya. And the question that the interrogator asked is, do you really believe that there's no good in the non-Jews whatsoever? And the story famously goes that the Alter Rebbe didn't answer the question, he just smiled. And the interrogator was so afraid that he let the question drop. Right, and of course, the explanation of the story that the Hasidim always said is that if the Alter Rebbe wanted, the Alter Rebbe was smiling because he was saying that if I wanted, I could answer that question for you too. But do you really want me to? Right? Do you really want me to tell you that? Because you saw I answered the other 9. Right? Do you really want me to answer the last question? So he didn't say the answer. He just smiled, and his interrogation from the Tsar dropped the issue. Nowadays, we are very privileged, we're very blessed. We live in a unique time in human history. This is the gist of both stories together, right? We are very blessed to live in a unique time of human history where most of the non-Jewish societies in which the Jews live are at least the righteous among the nations by default, right? There's a famous point made by the Rambam, made by Maimonides, that the spreading of the 2 other Abrahamic religions, right, is also part of God's plan. Right, that the reason God made so much of the world Christian and Muslim, right, was because embedded in Christianity and Islam are fundamentally the sustaining qualities that sustain civilization. What stops the idolater from going on his spiral of defining the human being as less and less of a thing until he can come to do great evil, right? The things that prevent it are the 7 Noahide laws. The 7 Noahide laws are the laws for preserving Yishuv Ha'olam, for preserving civilization, right? Courts of law, no animal cruelty, which is very interesting.
That's a problem
Worship of why?
with the Muslims. I won't say all the Muslims, but you take Iran.
There's lots of problems with everything. I agree. But nevertheless, the vast majority of non-Jewish societies in which we find, There's a lot. Every non-Jewish society in which Jews find themselves today is by the vast majority of normal people who keep the 7 Noahide laws by default, which prevents their society from going into a Nazi-like spiral, right? What happened, that's why the Rebbe explains in the letters that what happened to Nazi society, to German society, is that despite all of their sophistication, right, what basically happened is that this civilizational education, right, which is primarily based on choosing God over idols, right, with all of, we've just touched on some of the implications of this choice tonight, right? That entire choice, that entire civilizational choice was lost, it was forgotten, right? German society, especially in modernity after World War I, right, the whole story, their high civilization was about all sorts of other things. It was a humanist civilization, which said it didn't need God, right? And that, the Rebbe points out, that was the hubris, that was the problem, right? They thought they didn't need God, and what that sent them into, without the Noahide laws, they went into, or even by default, they went into a terrible downward spiral, right? Now, of course, all of this is more complicated than we're discussing, right? And of course, you have communities that keep most of the Noahide laws, or maybe even keep all of the Noahide laws, where terrible things happen and terrible things descend, right? But I think you'll see that in general, the majorities of those societies are still not like that. Right? Usually they're exceptional, more of an individual issue than a cultural issue. Why is that? Because those societies educate the next generation in the Noahide laws, which brings us all the way back to the end of chapter 1 of Tanya. We're now starting to wrap up, so nobody panic. I want to answer all 4 of our questions that we asked before, right? The first question is, why do only the Gentiles in the... So we see, before I even say that, we see that when the Alter Rebbe is saying there's no good in the Gentiles at all, even at a moral level, right? He's talking about the non-righteous among the nations, even probably the non-righteous among the nations by default, right? And all of a sudden, everything about the end of the first chapter of Tanya makes perfect sense, right? Number one, why do only the Gentiles get the label of good only for their own benefit? Don't we say this about the Jewish animal soul, right? The answer is that it's possible to do good in a selfish way, right? For both the Jewish animal soul and the soul of the righteous among the nations, which are both of Klipas Nega, which are both of the neutral, from the neutral animal position, right? Those souls are able to do good because it's good, seek the truth because it's true, and all of these, which intellectual principles, right, protected by the performance of the 7 Noahide laws, right, allow the person to attain a higher level of morality, right, a higher level of the morality that doesn't deny parts of the human being, but embraces the highest and the best in the human being, as the idolater cannot, right? So it's still from I am, right? But it's committed to keeping certain principles. There's limits to the I am, which is the same for the Jewish animal soul and the non-Jewish animal soul of the righteous among the nations. There's no real distinction there to be drawn, right? When we say that the non-Jew has no good in them whatsoever, and every good that they do is only for their selfish purpose, what are we talking about? We're talking about the non-righteous among the nations. We're talking about, in other words, totally uncivilized. And you see that uncivilized can mean Nazi Germany as well, right? Talking about totally uncivilized non-Jews, right? Non-Jews with no even default keeping of the 7 Noahide laws. Yes? Would you ever believe that if a Nazi did someone a favor, right, it was from pure selflessness? Right? You could believe it about Klipas Nega, maybe. You could believe it in some way, somehow. There's some level of selflessness to the righteous among the nations or to a Jew, right? But to a person with no civilization in terms of keeping the 7 Noahide laws, right, it becomes much more harder to understand. The second point, you can become Chassidei Umas Ha'elam if you're not Jewish, right? You can become the righteous among the nations. In fact, it's not even that difficult, right? You have to keep the 7 and commit to keeping the 7 Noahide laws, even by default. And what better if you do it in the ritual prescribed in the Torah, where you declare before the Beis Din that you do it because God told you to on Mount Sinai, right? Which is the ultimate in the seven Noahide laws. But one can become. That was the second question. The second question is: it seems we're talking about something that's not so fixed, and the answer is, on the contrary, we hope that it's not so fixed. We hope that people do become civilized, do change themselves, transform themselves. Number 3, the $1 million question: is everything the non-Jew does only negative? The answer is absolutely not. It depends what you mean by non-Jew, right? Nowadays, most non-Jews that we know, on the contrary, Hasidium by default, right? Righteous among the nations by default. They keep the 7 Noahide laws. So of course they can do good things, in the same sense that a selfish Jew can do good things, right? When I say selfish, I mean existentially selfish, right? That comes from the I am. That I am can end the sentence in I am kind, I am considerate of others, of course, right?
So from that perspective,
Yeah.
the non-Jew,
Yes.
righteous among the nations,
Yes.
the Jew, from a soul perspective,
Yes.
is the same.
In the animal soul, yes. If not the same, then very similar, yes.
So like they're both translucent, they both bring the
Correct, exactly right, exactly right. Number 4, the fourth question was, why are we talking about non-Jews at the end of the first chapter of Tanya, right? The answer is because the entire purpose of the Tanya, as we're going to see, the entire thrust of the Tanya, is that for a Jew to use his potential is not merely to do good because it's good. It's not merely to be civilized. It's not merely to be a good guy, right? These are all good things. These are all desirable things, right? But that's not what it means for a Jew to use their potential, as we're going to see. In other words, this is the perfect segue into the second chapter of Tanya. The perfect segue into the second chapter of Tanya, where we talk about the godly soul of the Jew, which is an incredible responsibility, right? That the Jew has unique potentials that must be used out at a totally different level, in a totally different way, right? That is going to be what the Alter Rebbe discusses for the rest of the Tanya. And so, as I was hoping to explain at greater length, but that was before I was over time by 20 minutes, right? The path to escaping I am is not through, for the Jew, right? And really for anyone, the path to escaping I am, right? We say, so what comes out of this is that non-Jews can be incredibly morally good and righteous, right? But all from a place of I am. The Jew's responsibility is going to be escaping the I am, right? Escaping the I am at the most profound level is going to be finding God saying I am, right? Which is a totally different things, right? And I should point out that the non-Jew can go an incredibly long way towards negating the I am, right? We're talking about a deep, fundamental, existential difference, right? It's not a conscious thing, not a thing that we're aware of, as we're going to see when we talk about the godly soul, right? We're talking about connecting to a fundamentally different factual reality, which is a divine one, right? And that is the Jew's responsibility. That is what that is the Jew's goal, and that's why the Jew is here on earth. And in fact, as we'll see, the Jew's whole task is different. The Jew's whole task in life is to be godly rather than to be an incredibly selfless and good human being, which is the non-Jew's job, or the total of the non-Jew's job, is to be an incredibly selfless and good human being, which is hard enough as it is, by the way. It's nothing to sneeze at. I'd like to just read the end of chapter 1 of Tanya. This is on page Vav, last few lines of the chapter. Page 6, last paragraph of chapter 1, somewhere in there. Unlike the souls of the non-Jews, they come from the other impure klippas, that have no good in them whatsoever. We now understand what this means at both the existential and moral level. As it says in Eitz Chaim, Shamim Test, the 49th gate, Perek Gimel, chapter 3, all the goodness that the nations of the world do, they do only for themselves. Pasuk v'chesed l'umim chatas, as is brought in the Gemara on the verse, the kindness of the nations is sin. Shekol tzedakah v'chesed shu b'saylam esin, all the charity and kindness that the nations of the world do, enan ela lehisyaher, is only to show off and to benefit, right? Which we know is true for Jews and the righteous among the nations as well, but not only. They're more complicated, right? Because there's a certain level of selflessness in the I am of the Jew and the righteous among the nations. Next week, God willing, we start a totally new chapter, chapter 2.
Well.
Only